Hello, everyone, and welcome once again to the Hulegaard Books podcast. As always, I'm your host, David K. Hulegaard, and we've got a good show for you today. My guest is the lovely and talented Julie Christine Johnson, the author of 2016's critically acclaimed novel, In Another Life. Her debut novel, by the way. Now, Julie's already got a second novel on the way, and we'll be discussing that and much more on the podcast. But before we get to my interview with Julie, I'd like to take a moment and extend my deepest condolences to Jim Ross and his family following the loss of his dear wife, Jan. She passed away last week after being struck by a car and suffering severe head injuries. I don't know Jim personally, but I grew up listening to him call some of the greatest wrestling matches of all time, and he always spoke so highly of Jan. She sounded like a real neat lady, and my heart goes out to all their friends and family. And with that said, let's move on to the show. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome my guest, Julie Christine Johnson.
I'm actually really excited for this opportunity to chat with you because we have a lot of great stuff to cover. But if it's okay with you, I'd like to start with kind of a look back at how it all began for you. Maybe just start with a bit of your early work. One of the things that I always think is fun to find out about writers is when did you know that you wanted to write? And was it something that you always had a passion for?
I read, when I was about 6 years old, I read Louise Fitzhugh's Harriet the Spy. And it's a novel that's set in Manhattan, and she wrote it in the 60s, and it's about a young girl who is a bit of a misfit, and she carries a journal around with her, and she writes everything down. And it gets her into a bit of a bad spot because the journal is found by friends of hers, and they read it, and she's written about them. Because she writes down all her observations about people, and she becomes a bit of a social outcast, and it's a learning lesson for her. But it just, I felt my fingers itching for a pen and a notebook reading that book, and I knew I wanted to write it, and I started writing stories after I read that book. And then I stopped. I stopped writing in high school, and I didn't start writing stories again until I was 40. So there was a long interlude of having the desire and wanting to write, but not doing it. I mean, literally just not sitting down and putting pen to paper. I did some academic writing. I wrote lots and lots of letters, and I kept journals from the time I was about 8 until I actually started writing fiction, and I quit journaling for several years after I started writing for publication. But it really took sort of a life crisis in my early 40s to convince me that this is what I needed to do.
So the writing bug never really left you. It just kind of went dormant for a while as you worked on other things?
Yeah, it's funny. I was considering an English major in college, and I was steered away from that by a couple of people who said, you're never going to get a job. What are you going to do with an English major? And that's such a cliche, but it's true. And I dropped it. I had started to pursue an English major and thought, what am I going to do besides teach? And I didn't want to be a teacher, which is funny now because I adore teaching. But I steered myself away from it and just said, no, you're right. How am I going to make money with an English major? So the intent was always there. The desire was always there. But I just let it go.
Mm-hmm. So for you think you would point to maybe Harriet the Spy as sort of that specific book that just kind of grabbed hold of you as a child and really stood out as the reason you wanted to create?
Absolutely. I connected with her need, not just her desire to write, but just this inexplicable need to put pen to paper, to put words to her thoughts, to put words to her observations. And I felt that it was a visceral thing. I felt it. I felt that connection through her with the page, and I can still remember. I can still remember turning those pages and going and getting a notebook notebook of my own after reading Harriet the Spy. So yeah, absolutely.
It's funny how, the things that stick with us, especially when we're so young and impressionable, because I remember, and you may think this is funny, but I remember like Ramona, probably being one of the first stories that, kind of grabbed me as a kid. And even though it was, I think probably considered a bit more, for girls or whatnot, I don't know. I found the Ramona stories so captivating.
Oh, I love those. I love those too. And it's funny. I mean, I even now, when I read just an extraordinary piece of writing or a wonderful story, I just get that itch to write. I hear authors say I can't really read while I'm writing because it distracts me, or I don't want to, be influenced by another author's themes or her style. But when I read wonderful writing, I want to write.
Mm-hmm. No, I know that feeling. Now, you mentioned that after reading Harriet the Spy, you wanted to start immediately writing little stories. So I'm just curious if you still remember, maybe one of the first things you wrote or something where you realized that you had a knack for writing.
I wrote fantasy stories, and it may have come from a school assignment, but I remember creating a map of the world. And of course, this was in the early mid-70s, and so The Hobbit had just come out. The animated movie had come out, and I had that soundtrack. And so I think there was something in me that felt that stories were best told as fantasy worlds. And so I was also very into Greek mythology. I was a geek, okay? I read Greek mythology, and my older brothers were thespians, and so they were bringing home annotated Shakespeare's because they were all in drama club in junior high and high school. And so all of these influences, these amazing literary influences that I had no idea were as astonishing as they were feeding into my imagination. And so what came out was very much sort of Narnian, Tolkien / Shakespearean fantasies when I was this little kid, and with a little bit of Greek mythology dashed in. So yeah, I was definitely not writing realistic fiction at that point. It was all just creating worlds.
Well, now that you've brought up Greek mythology and Tolkien, of course I'm going to go back and edit out everything I said about Ramona. I was kidding.
I know, and I loved Mrs. Pigglewiggle too. Not a chance. I love Beverly Cleary.
I guess whatever inspires us to read, right? As long as we're reading, that's all that matters.
Yeah, that's exactly it.
Well, when I first met you, I remember specifically you described yourself as more of a pantser than a plotter, which I loved because I found that somewhat relieving, honestly, because I hadn't really connected with a lot of authors or a lot of other writers, and the ones that I had were so detailed with like their outlines and their synopsis, and they had pages of just character description, and I really felt like I was doing something wrong. So it really made me feel better to know that I wasn't alone out there. But I'm curious what your writing process is like now. I mean, do you still consider yourself a pantser, or do you find yourself outlining a bit more?
Each book and each story I'm learning kind of takes its own path, and I'm learning to release myself to whatever the story demands. I think I'm now a little more structured, and the reason why I'm hesitating is that I don't necessarily start out with a lot of structure. I have come to start with my characters. So I tend to draft character sketches first, at least for my main characters and protagonist. And if there's a clear antagonist, I might do that as well. But I tend not to impose a lot of structure on the first draft. And as I get into subsequent drafts, I may go back and look at a story flow and see, sort of where I am in terms of word count and where I am in terms of story progression, because I do tend to write stories that have more of a plot as opposed to literary fiction that's more character based. So there is a story structure that cries out to be adhered to, and I'm a big believer in Lisa Crone's work, and she looks at the neurology of storytelling and how we as readers respond emotionally and physically to story structure. And I think there's a lot to that. So I've steered away a bit from completely pantsing and have and there's a lot of chaos for the writer. There's a lot of freedom, but there's a lot of chaos going back and cleaning up after that. So I am looking at a little more structure, and it really just depends on the story. I'm thinking now of doing some work in young adult fiction, and I think there, particularly if you're looking at multiple books, series, structure is the way to sanity.
I think sanity is the perfect word there, because there's nothing more frustrating than going back and reading something that you've written and then realizing that your plot line no longer makes sense, or your timeline is all off, and it could have been avoided.
Yeah, and I think that will happen even if you do impose some structure, because I'm in revisions now of something I finished a year and a half ago, and you take time away from it and come back and think, oh my goodness, wow, I don't have to start completely over, but there's a large part of this that needs to be rewritten. So that's where pantsing comes in handy, where you just allow yourself to let the story pour forth.
No, very true. I've actually seen it written that once you write a story and you put it out into the universe, it no longer belongs to you. It belongs to the reader. Yeah. And I thought that was such a beautiful sentiment. And it really put some perspective for me behind reader reviews, something that I think that most writers probably have a love-hate-love relationship with. One of the things that I've seen about you is your writing style has been described as romance with a touch of magical realism. And I'm just wondering how you feel about that, and how would you describe your writing style?
I love that. I'm a very lyrical writer and a very descriptive writer, and I have experimented, and it's been very satisfying with a far more lean and spare style in short stories and flash fiction, and that's a great exercise for any writer to sort of work on their short chops and just write a really clean and lean story. But I love descriptive prose, and I love elegant prose that takes its time. And for me as a writer, growing as a writer, learning when that's most effective and most appropriate, and then also learning when to speed things up and when a part of a story or a plot line or something really needs just quick jabs and just spark. So yes, I think that's true. But I'm experimenting and having fun and growing in other styles as well.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose we always are, right? As long as we're working on something, we hope we're constantly evolving.
Yeah, definitely.
I think one of my favorite parts personally about writing is doing all the research, and I've met other writers that have a similar love for it, and I've seen some just amazing detailed folders, like color coded with all kinds of information that it definitely goes beyond anything I've probably put into my research, but I digress. You've been able to travel the globe and really see some incredible places that have served as the backdrop for your novels. Did you find that these locations helped inspire your stories, or were they places that you'd always wanted to write about?
Oh, very, very much so. I'm definitely a writer of place, and I think that's so often where I begin is with a sense of place and knowing I want to set a story here, and somehow weaving the character and the place together so that the place becomes a natural character in the story. It's always been important for me to know where I am in the world, and that where I am is a place that inspires me. So where I live, and living in one of the most beautiful places on earth, is not a coincidence for this writer.
Doesn't hurt.
Yeah, that's right. But yeah, absolutely, and I don't think I've ever intentionally traveled to a place to write about it, but places where I have been have left marks on me and marks on my soul that may have sat there for years and years and years until finally I found the right time and the right character to use that place.
Now, you mentioned, the place where you live now, the Olympic Peninsula and the beautiful Pacific Northwest. Obviously, living there, there's plenty of beauty to draw from. But I'm wondering if there's maybe a particular place outside of home that you visited that maybe stands out as one of your absolute favorites.
I've written about France, and I'm probably not done writing about southwestern France. And my next novel is set in Ireland, the one that's coming out in September, and I'm revising one now that's set in New Zealand. So I have all these incredible, beautiful places where I've lived and traveled and that have really captured my heart. I've been working on a short story for some time that is nominally set in Chad, where in Central Africa, where I spent time as a Peace Corps volunteer, and that is a place that was not pleasant and was a very physically and emotionally and psychically very, very challenging place to be. And I've been struggling for the better part of a quarter of a century trying to articulate how that place shaped and changed me, and how I can be kind to it in my writing and sort of work out what a place like that means.
Wow. I mean, you really have been to some amazing places. And sometimes I think, well, I've been to Canada. So
which is beautiful.
It doesn't sound as impressive to just go to Canada, but yeah, it really is a beautiful place, and I've actually thought about that too. Just the places that we go and the things that we see along the way. We're always observing and bringing bits and pieces of that back with us when it's time to, put story to paper. Speaking of putting story to paper, let's switch gears a little bit and talk about getting published. The path to traditional publishing is different for everyone. There's querying and waiting and dealing with rejections, all of which can be devastating. Was there ever a point when you became discouraged when you went through that process, or were you able to find your agent very early on?
Yes, and I think my story is exceptional, and I'm so grateful and blessed that the stars aligned so quickly for me, and it wasn't deserved, but it just happened that way. I pitched my first novel at a conference, at a regional conference, and pitched it to several agents and publishing editors. And subsequently, about 3 weeks later, one of the agents and one of the editors called literally on the same day and offered me representation and publication. And they were known to each other. They had worked together before, and it came together very quickly and very serendipitously. And then after that, certainly trying to sell my second novel was where I really had my first taste of this is what it's like to get shot down over and over and over again. It is, and I certainly have the support of an agent who helped me keep my perspective, and I worked through a rewrite, and the novel did sell eventually. But it's brutal, and what's so hard about it is that you're waiting for other people to make a decision about your life and your work, and that gatekeeper process is frustrating, and there's no antidote for it. You just either make the decision to wait and go through it, or pull your stuff and rewrite, or try another route, which could be self-publishing or a hybrid publisher. So it's brutal, and it's not fair, and it's the odds, I think, of landing an agent, and then the odds of that agent landing your manuscript are lightning strike odds, and it happens, and it doesn't happen oftentimes for any reason other than complete chance.
It's funny, over the last year and a half or so, some of my friends they're also writers have gone on to find tremendous success both in self-publishing and traditional publishing, and I kind of felt like maybe if I just wait, my turn is coming.
Yeah.
But it can be very, very discouraging, and I find that self-doubt can definitely sneak in when you least expect it, and you really just kind of have to pick your head up and keep writing. And so now you went through, or I should say you got to experience both sides of it, where you did have like this very chance encounter that worked out well, and then you went through kind of that process of dealing with rejection and whatnot. But before you know it, bam, right? You got yourself that first deal, and your debut novel, In Another Life, released in February 2016. So I'm curious, as someone who's gone through that, what was going through your mind after finding out that you were going to be published?
It's so surreal, and there's this blissful moment of maybe a few weeks before you get the manuscript back from your editor, where you just kind of ride that glow of, I'm going to be a published author, and it's an amazing feeling, and the sense of validation is tremendous. And then this sort of tidal wave of fear and horror washes over you as you realize everyone is going to read your book. And you think, no, that's my baby. So there's so many mixed emotions, that there's deep pride and joy, and there's also tremendous trepidation and anxiety in realizing that you're releasing your soul, you're bearing your soul to the world, and there really isn't. It's not a matter of developing a thick skin. It's just, I think, learning how to deal with and respond to the inevitable comments, whether they're wonderful or they're not so wonderful. and that's truly where I had to just tell myself over and over again, as you said, that once it's out in the world, it belongs to the reader, and you come to that understanding, and you release yourself from worrying about it, and to say, I've done my part, I've done my best, and now it doesn't belong to me anymore.
Yeah, I had Tony Healy on this show last time, and he was telling me that as the writer, you should never read the reviews of your own book, and it's just kind of funny, right? You just you have to have, I guess, a good sense of humor about it, because opinions are very subjective, and some people will love, some people will hate. It nets out in the end, I hope.
Yes, absolutely. No, I couldn't agree more. I do read my trade reviews, my industry reviews, but reader reviews I don't, I don't feel I have a right to have a feeling about their opinions, because that experience belongs to them now. And it's, you either get inflated or you get crushed. And why go in either direction? Just leave it alone. Yeah.
Well, speaking of feeling inflated by positive reviews and whatnot, I mean, just 3 days after the release of In Another Life, it went into its second printing. How did that feel for you to know that was just so quickly going into a second printing?
Yeah. I was just so delighted, and I was sitting on the ferry, actually. I'd spent a week in Seattle the first week after the book was published, doing book readings at bookstores in the Puget Sound area, and I was sitting on the ferry coming home. I was exhausted, I mean, just to the point of tears. I just wanted to come home and have a glass of wine and take a hot bath and forget about all of this book publishing nonsense. And I looked at my Twitter feed, and my publisher had not contacted me directly or emailed me or called me. They just posted something on Twitter. That's how we find out about news in the world. And I was ecstatic. I was just thrilled.
Well, I cheated because I think I ran into you like the day after you found out, and and I have to say I thought that you handled it in such humble Julie fashion, whereas the rest of us that know you were freaking out for you. So, I mean, it's been a hell of a journey, right? I mean, looking back on the year that's followed, I mean, gosh, it's 13 months now. So looking back on all that time since the book came out, I mean, what would you say are the biggest learnings that you've taken from that whole experience?
I think that there needs to be, at least for me, a lot of self-care and deep breaths, expectations of support, expectations of success or failure can be unreasonable either way. And everyone told me, and I hear this and I believe this, but when you're in the midst of it, it's hard to remember that this is a marathon, not a sprint. And your objective as an author is to dig in for the long haul, that your book will have a second life. It's not, it's not make or break in the first month or the first 6 months or even the first year. And that your job is to advocate for your work and to keep writing. I don't think I was prepared for sort of the emotional and physical toll that publishing would have. And so many of us, not all of us, but many of us are introverts, and the need to be out there, not necessarily public. I love public speaking. I have no fear of that at all, but the need to constantly be on social media, the need to be accessible, the need to be a presence is very wearing, and it really steals time from your writing and steals energy from your writing. And so I had heard that. Other authors had done a wonderful job of preparing me, but until you're in the middle of it, it's hard to imagine that you're just going to be drained. You're going to be drained of words for a long time to come.
You know, it's funny that you mentioned that, because something that I used to enjoy was blogging. And once I started getting very serious about wanting to write full time, to commit time and energy to writing novels, I found myself feeling very, I guess I should say, I'm wary of how much time I want to spend doing stuff like that anymore. And you're right. It is, your connection to the public is really through things like a website or social media account. But it is difficult to figure out how much time to commit to each, because you really just, you want to spend your every free moment just, writing more pages and more pages.
Yep.
Do you still find time to blog and dedicate time to social media?
I used to blog once a week, and I look back at that and I think, how? Who did that? Oh my God. Where did those words come from? Where did that time come from? And now I aim for once a month to once every 6 weeks. I do keep up on, I used to belong to Twitter groups and Twitter chat groups for writers, and I can't do any of that anymore.
Mm-hmm.
And I also work full-time out, a full-time day job. So I really have to pace myself. My author Facebook page, if I can get something up there once a week, when things are active, that's great for me. Twitter has been a wonderful way to connect with other writers and support other writers. And so that's where I try to expend my energy. I'm still relatively active on Goodreads, which has been a great way for me to think about writing and process writing and meet readers. You have to do the things that you love to do. And if anything comes in between you and the page, then you need to reassess how you're spending your time. And I have to do that every day. Why am I not writing? What is keeping me from the page?
Mm-hmm. Well, and time management, it kind of leads me into my next question, really, because, while you were still basking in the afterglow of your debut novel, you were privately nearing completion on a second novel. So I guess, naturally, my first question is, when the hell did you sleep? But secondly, are you one of those writers that likes to be tinkering on a project at all times, or do you feel that it's important to give yourself time to rest, to kind of in between projects?
Yeah, it is important to rest, but I haven't given myself that permission yet. And I just, I got caught up in this loop as I was putting one novel to bed and finishing up edits and revisions on my debut. I had another one out there selling, and then it sold, and then those revisions had to get going while I was promoting my debut. And so I just got myself into this, cycle that kind of a hamster wheel. And I had finished writing the first draft of a third novel in the midst of all this, and that just had to be set aside for months and months. And I literally just picked it up in January again, and I'm hoping to get it out on submission in early May and finish those revisions. So yeah, I love always having something to work on. I'm going a little bit crazy because I'm so anxious and eager to start something new. And I have been anxious and eager to do that for months. And I can't until this third novel is out the door, on its way, trying to get sold. And that's also a really healthy thing to do, I think, when you have something out there that you're waiting to hear feedback from, that you have another project underway, and that your heart is into that new project, so that you can just let the rest, everything else go. The things that you don't have control over while you're waiting for those gatekeepers to decide what to do with your work. It's so important, I think, to have something else in hand and in your heart.
No, absolutely. So let's spend a second actually talking about the second novel. So it is titled The Crows of Berra, and it's releasing later this year in September, and it's coming from Ashland Creek Press. So what can you tell us about this novel's protagonist, Annie Crow?
Mm-hmm. Annie's an American, and she has just come out of a stint in rehab. She's an alcoholic, and she is basically given a kind of a last chance assignment. She's a PR person in Seattle, and she's asked to go to a community in Southwest Ireland to sell them on a copper mine. And copper has recently been discovered again. Copper used to be mined in this area quite some time ago in the 1860s. And so copper's been found again offshore, and some threads of it a little bit onshore. And so she goes to sell this community on a copper mine. and it's being developed right in an area where there's a bird species that's native to the area would be threatened. Their habitat would essentially be destroyed. And so she gets herself into a moral dilemma, into trying to decide, how this job is basically the last thing that she has to hold on to. She's destroyed everything else in her life. And so how does she cope with what she's been asked to do at the risk of kind of destroying the rest of her life? And it's really about the healing power of art, about the healing power of place. And there's also a legend that's woven into it that really becomes her guide, her moral guide, and her emotional guide as she decides what she's going to do.
Now, when I met you, I think you had just come back from a trip to Ireland, and I remember you spoke about this experience that you had there. That just sounded like this amazing thing that all writers get to experience. But what I'm interested in is, I didn't know you that well at the time, and so we didn't get to talk about it much in depth. But I'm wondering how that experience that you had in Ireland might have had an influence on shaping this novel.
Mm-hmm. I had traveled. The novel set on the Berra Peninsula, which is in County Cork in southwest Ireland, and it's the first place that I had visited in Ireland. I first went there in 2002, and I was forever changed. The place, the people, what I did there. I hiked there alone. It was transformative, and it took me, over a decade to be able to articulate it in a story. But what sort of launched me into writing this story was coming across the poetry of a young Irish poet by the name of Leanne O'Sullivan. And she has written about the Berra Peninsula and has written about the legend that I use in the story. And she's also written about the mining culture on the Berra Peninsula. And these things just all kind of came together as I was doing a bit of research for the story and not knowing what I wanted it to be about at all. I just knew I wanted to set it in Ireland. And when I went, at the time that I met you, I had gone back to the Berra for the first time since I first traveled there in 2002. And I went to do a poetry workshop with Leanne. And that was just serendipitous and an extraordinary experience. And it brought me back to that place, literally, and it brought me back to that place in my soul. And I had never written poetry before. And as a prose writer who loves poetry and reads poetry, to actually sit down and challenge myself to compose poems, under the guide of such an extraordinary poet as Leanne, changed my writing. And so all of those things, conspired in this magical 2 weeks. And even though I had basically finished the novel at that point, I had time to go back and work on my prose and work on some of the details in the story, but just come back to it with a heart so full of the power of art. And I was able to really weave that theme into the story in a much stronger way than I had before.
I remember, kind of listening to you tell stories after you had come back, and I can honestly say that I don't think I've ever wanted to see Ireland as much as I did listening to you, recount your experiences there, and knowing that, so much of that is going to be in the interior of the Crows of Berra. I'm very excited to read your novel.
Thank you.
Now, I know you touched on this a little bit earlier, but your book deals with some environmental themes relating to the kind of the coal mining encroaching on the space of an endangered bird. I'm curious, was this an issue that you'd set out to address early on, or was it something that became more prominent as you researched the area?
The latter. I hadn't quite decided what sort of the story problem would be, and in reading Leanne's poetry and recalling from my time there that the copper mining had been an industry on the Berra in the 1860s, and I thought, wait a second, I can bring this back. And so that's where the make-believe came in, but truly injected with some truth. And then I'm struggling now, 3 years on, to remember how I ran into the red-billed chough, which is the endangered bird. But in some research that I did in the area, I realized their habitat was right in where the natural part where the copper mines had been in that area back in the 1860s, and they're all dry now, and they've all been, they're just historical relics now. But I brought them back and put sort of this modern spin on it of development versus saving the environment, and there is some ambiguity. It's not all black and white. It's not all we must save the bird. I said it at a time a few years ago when Ireland was in the trenches again economically, and introducing the question of how do we meet halfway? Is that possible? Is it possible to save an economy and still save an endangered species? So yeah, it was definitely something that came about as I got to know these characters and as I began to do the research into the area.
Oh, that's really cool. I'm kind of skipping around a little bit here, but you touched on something earlier that kind of got my gears spinning, which was talking about social media usage and how Twitter had become such a great platform for you for connecting with other authors and things of that nature. And I found that to be the same for myself. And not to bring the mood down, but while I've got you, I wanted to talk to you about something that I've been noticing a lot on Twitter, specifically over the past few months, and really get your perspective. What I've noticed is that a fair number of writers that I talk to or follow have mentioned difficulties focusing on their work in light of the U.S. presidential election last November. And I'm curious if the election has affected you as a writer at all.
Yeah, that's such a good question. Yes, in the sense that I, like those other writers, find myself really struggling to drill down and focus. And in some ways, the writing becomes the relief because I'm not writing anything political, and at least now, and it's a chance to get away from the headlines. But when things are changing daily or more frequently as they are, it's really hard to focus, and it's also hard to remind yourself, what is mine to do? As an artist, as a writer, how am I responsible for effecting change? And how can I make my voice heard? And what should I be writing about? Should I be writing more political things? Should I be, is fiction still relevant? Are romantic stories still relevant? And so you have all these voices sort of swirling in your head, and what all that means is you're not writing. And I know in my heart that that art is as important now as it has ever been, and that there isn't a necessity to be writing politically driven things, that we don't have to be always, sort of topical, that there is room and there is reason for things that take us away, that we can entertain and that we can provide comfort and nurturing through stories, and that storytelling is absolutely vital.
No, it's so true. And I really had to, even before asking you this question, I had to stop and think about it for myself, because I know that, I write a lot of science fiction and fantasy, and it really is a good opportunity for me to step outside of, reality and think about the problems and whatnot of make-believe worlds. And I found it to be such a great release that I do need a break sometimes, because if you pick up Twitter or turn on the news, inevitably within seconds, you're outraged or depressed, or maybe both. And I found it to be a great outlet to just turn off the TV, turn off social media, and just dive back into something that I feel like I have more control over. So it's good. I mean, I'm really glad to hear that, and I think that obviously there's no wrong way to react to what's happening in the world. But I do agree with you 100% that, art has never been more important than it is right now. And I'm glad there are people just still out there fighting the good fight on both sides.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I can see that, unfortunately, our time is almost up. I know, boo. But I'm not going to end on a super serious note. So I've got to ask you, I mean, we've talked about the success of In Another Life. We've talked about the upcoming release of The Crows of Berra. You've mentioned, a third novel in the works. So I'm curious, what's next for you? What does 2017 have in store for you?
Yeah. Well, the launch happens in September, and I feel much more prepared and calmer this second time around. And I'm really hoping to get this third novel out the door and on my agent's desk and just walk away from it and leave it to her to sell the thing, hopefully. So I'm hoping by summer I'll be working on new material. And I have been for the last year, really since In Another Life launched, finding myself missing the Cathars and missing Languedoc and missing a bit of that time slip. And I've had in my heart a young adult series, kind of a dystopian time travel thing. So I'm hoping to have some fun with that. And that's really where my heart is just wanting to dive back into some just good old-fashioned, wonderful lose yourself storytelling.
Well, that's awesome. I am not surprised at all that you're going to be extremely busy. But hopefully you'll still remember to take that rest that we talked about earlier. So before I let you go, is there anything you need to plug? Any shout-outs you want to cover?
No, I'm just so grateful for you. And the one thing that I do miss since I've come back to work full time is teaching and meeting other writers. And the classes that you participated in were at least as educational for me as for anyone. So I miss that, and I miss that fellowship and that community very much. So I think that's the greatest thing truly about being a writer is learning from and interacting with other writers. So I'm so grateful for this podcast and for all that you do.
Well, I appreciate that, and I really appreciate your time. I know you are super busy, and I'm just delighted that we had an hour to cut out of our day and spend it together chatting. Hopefully it won't be the last, whether it's in podcast form or just over coffee. Always a pleasure to talk to you. I'm so excited for what's in store for you. The Crows of Berra just sounds so fantastic. I cannot wait. And, of course, anything else you're working on beyond that. It just gives me something to put on my reading list, on my Goodreads list, as it were.
Wonderful.
Well, thank you again, Julie. I will let you get back to your day, and I look forward to chatting with you again very soon.
Oh, as do I. Thank you so much, Dave.
All right, folks, that's going to conclude another episode of the Hulegaard Books podcast. I'd like to once again thank my guest, Julie Christine Johnson. If you'd like to stay in touch with her and learn more about her, you can visit Julie on the web at juliechristinejohnson.com. You can also follow her on Twitter at juliechristinej. If you missed that, don't worry. I'm including the links in the YouTube description. Thank you all so much for listening, and we'll see you again next time.